This video is not what I thought it would be. What started as a look into bizarre Jesus-based diet books spiraled into investigating the way something as deceptively simple as food has become a recruitment tool for the worst of the far right in America. Let me explain. Food is both universal, we've all got to eat, but also deeply personal. It's tied to culture, religion, worldview, as well as more specific family traditions. And because food is a necessary part of life, it can also be used as a means of control or a source of power. The universal nature of food, cooking and eating itself, means food can be a kind of sleeper agent tool for extreme political beliefs. And the far right in America, it's doing it expertly. While researching for this video, I ended up reading a bunch of articles and books about things like the rise of the alt-right and the history of American conservatism, and for the most part, they didn't mention food at all. One of the political uses for food that you're most likely to have noticed can be seen in politicians themselves. Trump, for example's obsession with fast food on the campaign trail was seen by many as a kind of testament to this nationalistic Americanness that he had. His most infamous appeal to the Latin vote consisted of a social media post captioned, "Happy Cinco de Mayo, the best taco bowls are made in Trump Tower Grill. I love Hispanics," with a picture of him grinning posed with a taco bowl and a thumbs up. In classic Trump fashion, the caption is, at least in part, about bigging himself and his company up, but it also betrays this lack of cultural knowledge. Cinco de Mayo is not a universal Hispanic or Latin celebration, but it is specific to Mexico. The bowl itself is an Americanized mix of minced beef and iceberg lettuce and shredded cheddar, and Trump at that time was intent on building a boulder wall with inflammatory speeches and fear-mongering about immigrants to do it. But it isn't just literal politicians who politicize food. In fact, they might be the least significant example. Consider everyday tensions around food that you've probably already seen instead. Think about Asian Americans you've heard in person or online talk about being bullied in school for bringing in food from their cultural background, told it was gross or smelly or disgusting.
My friends and peers would make fun of the traditional Chinese and Vietnamese food that I would bring to school. They would say that it was weird or that it smelled. So I was always embarrassed of my culture's food, which is really sad to think about now. But this happens to so many children of immigrant families. It's really hard to appreciate your culture growing up in a society that makes you feel insecure about it.
These are children who are used to thinking about food in one way, perpetuating racist and xenophobic ideas, often without realising that's what they're doing against their peers. Or what about the way that table manners have been used as markers of class? Which fork to use for which course as a lesson taught to those used to fine dining?
You may be mine on paper. In the eyes of God, she belongs to Thomas Andrews.
It's all for me. Just start from the outside and work your way in.
If you've had no reason to use multiple utensils in a setting with strict etiquette, there's no reason to know these rules, but not following them immediately identifies you as different. Food can easily be used to signal in and out group status, what people eat and how they eat it, what rituals are connected to it, what is seen as normal, can be used to understand, even subconsciously, who is an us or a them. While working on this video, I reached out to my supporters on Patreon to see if any of them had first-hand experience of right-wing American connections to food, and the responses came thick and fast. I'll be including some of their thoughts in the video, and I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description if you want to check out the community and join yourself and help support the channel. In this video, I'll also be including clips of conversations that I've had with two really amazing food-focused authors as well, who gave such interesting insight. So I guess let's jump in at the deep end with one of the most divisive political issues in the US, gun laws. Food is used over and over in the ever-present arguments around gun rights. The idea that hunting, providing for your family, is justification for not just gun ownership, but a lack of oversight or restrictions on guns altogether. Hunting is, within this argument, linked to ideas around nationalistic American individualism and self-sufficiency, as well as masculine stereotypes of the hunter and provider in a literal archaic sense. And this is where I want to start today. Before we dive into that, welcome to the most ironic video ad from a sponsor you'll see all year, Bellesa, a buy women for anyone sexual wellness brand. Big shout out to them for agreeing to sponsor this video because some other brands wouldn't because of the topic, and also for sending this asexual lesbian a bunch of toys to give to her friends to get their feedback. Their mission to help anyone embrace and explore their sexuality is pretty obvious from their new Whisper Tech range of silent toys, meaning they're kind of perfect for people who are looking for something discreet and still powerful. I mean, you might not be discreet, but the toys will be discreet. Sorry, that was really bad. So just how quiet and discreet is it, you ask? Well, allow me to demonstrate. I'm going to turn it on. You can hear it with a click. Now, obviously, I'm holding this next to a mic, and mics are kind of designed to pick up noise, so hopefully the lack of noise will tell you something. But I also thought it would be kind of fun to show you a comparison to another thing that you might have around your flat, which is something that vibrates and makes noise, so you can really compare the difference. Yeah, I think you get it. So how did they do in the reviews? So I sent out 4 classic toys, and here are the texts that I got in reply. So this is the Whisper Wand, and my friend said, yeah, she's rumbly, like deep whiskey voice lesbian rumbly. This is the Whisper Rabbit. I don't know if you can see through the blur, but it has 2 independently adjustable sections. The review for this, and I'm reading this verbatim, was, holy shit, all capitals, 2 exclamation marks. I've been using the same rabbit for about 10 years, my fave, my ride or die, but this has replaced it, I fear. That ... was unreal. And then this one that I showed you earlier, the bullet, the review to this was, well, hello sailor. No, for real, loved it. Perfect option for my vaginismus having self. And then finally, what I think is my favourite review, if you know, you know, this is the Whisper Vibe. And the review just says, who knew vibes took estrogen? This is so soft, what the fuck? Now, I know there are a bunch of people in my audience who will be interested in these, so Bless has suggested a giveaway, but the kind of giveaway where everyone gets a free toy with any Whisper Tech order, so is it a giveaway so much as just getting a free gift? Either way, anyone who signs up gets a free Whisper Vibe or a free viral rose suction toy with any Whisper purchase. The link is going to be in the description to grab your new toy. Part 1. Food and Masculinity. The image of a camo-donning, gun-covered far-right protester is one that's become depressingly familiar over the past decade in the US. This image is one of practice masculinity, a costume removed from its original purpose, store-bought army fatigues from people not in the military, green and brown camouflage doing absolutely nothing to hide the wearer in an urban environment where these rallies often find their stage. Increasingly, this subsection of the far-right focuses on guns as part of militias, armed groups of mainly men who are outside of government control. For some groups, like the much too jovially named Boogaloo movement, these militias are important because they are a necessary part of an inevitable civil war. For others, it's a racist dog whistle about protecting their families from blacks and illegals. But wait, aren't they all the far right? What's this about different movements and motivations and ideas? To break it down as simply as I can, what we call the far right, as if it's this united political front, is in fact a patchwork of beliefs, organisations and communities. Some of these groups focus around one core principle, stoked by fear, often. These principles might include anything from the pursuit of white nationalism, including making America a white ethno-state, that is, a country limited to white people, elevating Christian supremacy and evangelism, including enforcing religious law, spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, including both those propagated by the Nazis and newly developed ideas too, violent anti-abortion extremists who pursue a reduction of reproductive rights both through law and policy, as well as pickets and intimidation at clinics, or even outright physical violence and domestic terrorism. Incels and misogyny-focused hatred, seen by many as an online problem, but which has increasingly been linked to the abuse and murder of women in the real world too. Many far-right movements ultimately combine elements of extreme right-wing ideology, folding like anti-immigrant ideas with queer and transphobia or ableism into their actions. For example, someone who is promoting white nationalism is also having to define who counts as white and rationalizing whiteness as a race specific enough to be a biologically superior one. And so this is where anti-Semitism would cross over, even for Jewish people who might otherwise be considered white because of the links to historical fascist ideologies, or consider someone who's elevating evangelical Christian values. They are often not just spreading the belief in God, but are also targeting LGBTQ+ rights or developing torturous conversion therapies to enforce their interpretation of that belief system. The far right, therefore, can sort of be seen as like the world's worst series of Venn diagrams, I guess. Okay, so back to these gun rights groups within the far right. Groups which are able to exist due to, ironically, the lack of restrictive gun laws in much of the US that already exist. When gun reform is being debated, using "I want a militia" as a reason against gun reform, it's not really a promising tactic. It's too extreme a reasoning for most people, right? And so the justification instead comes down to legitimate uses like hunting, for example. Already a part of the mythic image of the red-blooded American, the right to own a gun and hunt for your family, or honestly just for sport, is not a far-right talking point as much as a vaguely right-leaning one. But for those on the far right, it has the bonus of being a legitimate cover for other gun usage. And it celebrates a kind of masculinity which can be a gateway to more extreme views. Meat itself is tied to American masculinity after all. Burgers, bacon, steak, all the way to the carnivore diet. Real men man the grill, order the ribeye, and could absolutely shoot their dinner dead to do it if they had to. I spoke to a friend who's American about this, and she told me about a friend of hers whose husband started to literally cry around a discussion about their children's breakfast. So he asked his wife to do all the cooking, getting him and the kids, 2 boys and a girl, breakfast at the start of the day. She made them things like yogurt, fruit and granola, and he protested. The image of a good wife and mother was one who made like full American breakfast spreads with sausage and bacon and eggs, after all. She explained to him like, hey, our kids like yogurt and fruit, whereas he says, that's not a nourishing, healthy meal. He was so upset at the idea his sons would believe a real American breakfast from mom is yogurt that he was in tears. And this is someone without hunting meat as part of their family activities or culture. Just the consumption of it was vital to his image of Americanness. One Patreon supporter told me about her experience in a family who hunted regularly. My dad was a big hunter, and he put everyone through gun safety so they could hunt with him as soon as possible. I remember the one and only year I went hunting with my dad. I did not shoot the single deer I saw because the family law was that you had to clean your own kill, and I thought that would be gross. I was exempt from the mandatory liking of hunting because I'm a girl, and hunting was mostly for the boys. There was also a tradition of eating the heart of the deer the same day they got it. Eating organs is not really unusual, but there was a certain amount of macho man energy that went into this with my family. Honestly, I think a lot of the hunting and meat stuff was all about how to prove your manhood. If you got the most deer, caught the biggest fish, provided meat for the family table, then you could be man enough to earn the approval of all the other men. I think it's pretty easy to see how those on the further edges of right-wing America might be able to utilize this masculinized connection to hunting and guns, which is pervasive in comparatively moderate spaces, to encourage a process of radicalization. This is something we've very much seen outside of America too, with gun clubs and hunting groups further afield reporting alt-right interests. Young men who have inherited a gallant kind of view of gender, where men provide for their families, who are used to going out hunting to bond with their cousins. What might it take to lead them down the path towards more extreme versions of their existing beliefs? That the reason that men provide is because women are incompetent, especially when the views are being espoused by men who fit the mold of masculinity that they've been told to respect. Yeah, this image of American masculinity, particularly, let's be honest, white American masculinity, it's not some pure line of tradition passed down from Wild West cowboys to today's backyard grillers. In fact, the image has been carefully curated over the decades. The book A Taste of Power talks about the construction of rugged masculine food as a political movement way back in the 1800s. Hunting's virtue was to link apparent danger and the application of violence to a method for securing meat supplies that, paradoxically, was no longer necessary because meat was now widely available through mass production. Old Teddy Roosevelt co-founded the Boone and Crockett Club, a version of which actually still exists today in the 1800s, inspired by the mythologized image of the intrepid American man as a rugged frontier survivor. Roosevelt felt the club should exist to promote manly sport with a rifle. Roosevelt was born this kind of sickly, asthmatic child and then relentlessly pursued a traditionally masculine body and persona, engaging in pretty much every physical activity he could, from wrestling to weightlifting to climbing and more. And when faced with very intense personal tragedy, like the tough man he was, he turned to emotional shutdown, alleging to have never mentioned his first wife's name again after her death, and writing to his sister after he became a rancher and a hunter that he was seeking out enough excitement and fatigue to prevent overmuch thought. The West Cure, they called it at the time. Nowadays, the Boone and Crockett Club is focused around hunting as a form of preservation, but the outings in Roosevelt's day involved the killing of thousands of animals tallied onto competitive score sheets. As Professor Vesta explains, campfire cooking evoked hunting, fishing, and warfare as a reference to soldiers' camp life, as well as the frontier. Engaging in the same ritual enabled citified men to express more rugged masculinities and hark back to a mythical past past in which white male privilege was allegedly unchallenged by women, people of colour, and immigrants. Except for the camp and campfire itself, some of the traits of campfire cooking, including its simplicity and heartiness, could be transported back into apartment kitchenettes and later to suburban backyards as a ritualistic act affirming the cook's masculinity. Also, cookbooks and literary text argued, starting in the 1920s, extolling an old but actually inventing a new tradition of manly cooking. Underlying this curating of masculinity as a regimented bioessentialist idea based on sex, that men and women are naturally so different that even their relationship with food should be too. Not just different amounts of like calories or macronutrients, but the types of tastes that they should enjoy even. And so to stray from those prescribed ways of eating would call into question your manhood. This is a huge one in my family. I remember especially my dad and brothers making fun of anyone who had dietary preferences that didn't include meat, like vegetarians are sissies kind of thinking. It went as far as believing people who liked plain cheese pizza were lame. Policing other people's food choices was the thing to do, especially if you were one of the boys. I think we often think of food policing as a problem mainly affecting women and girls. Concerns about eating disorders and dysmorphia, where their thoughts about their own bodies are dictated by what they see in like the media and wider society. And I am going to talk later in this video about that part, but I think it's important to acknowledge here that men and boys' relationships with food can be similarly pressure-filled, because a whole lot of the time these pressures are ultimately about gender itself, whether for men or women.
A croissant? Is that seriously what you eat? You wake up in the morning, you have a croissant?
Yes.
You like your croissants?
Performing gender in how and what you eat, shrinking yourself as a woman, and upholding masculinity as a man. So what we've culturally decided is masculine and feminine food becomes part of that performance. And so if you're part of a political movement, like much of the far right, which is invested in enforcing traditional gender roles, this is a bias that you can absolutely take advantage of. After all, the urge is so strong and tied to identity that we see examples of people insisting on this biological division of food while ignoring the reality of medical biology. My dad is a born and raised Republican. After his heart attack, he struggled with not eating as much red meat. There's like this strange ideological association with masculinity. My dad doesn't want his friends to know him and my mum eat Mediterranean now, even though they know about his heart attack. So what does an alt-right diet look like? And how is it used as a tool of recruitment? Surely eating a certain diet doesn't have to mean anything about your politics. Well, I mean, tell that to the soy boys. Alt-right ideas of diet and masculinity have a number of interesting intersecting strands, but none have entered the mainstream so quickly and in a more far-reaching way than the concept of the soy boy, a derogatory way to refer to a man who isn't, well, manly enough. The term is not, as many assume, specifically in relation to men who literally engaged in vegetarianism. Instead, it's based on the pseudoscience assertion that phytoestrogen in soy products will feminize men who eat them. It's not just the accusation of a plant-based diet being socially feminizing, but literally medically gender degrading as well. And then there's the likes of Andrew Tate, who preach a kind of control to young men that quickly turns from a control of diet and exercise into a control of women.
So I eat once a day. I eat dinner only. 80% of my calories come from meat. I have 10 cups of coffee a day and 3 or 4 large cigars.
One of the authors I spoke to for this video, Dr. Mara Einstein, who specializes in the intersection between branding and belief systems, particularly cults, brought up Tate during our conversation.
The interesting thing about Andrew Tate is that his university, first of all, it's not a university, but is just teaching repackaged stuff that anybody could take time to look up on the internet and not have to pay him $50 a month for. But he too uses the same kinds of cult-like tactics. One, to get people to sign up. You know, you're not masculine enough. You need to learn these tools. You should be making as much money as I'm making. All of that sort of thing. And then once they get them in, make it hard for them to leave. Oh, what? You can't afford $50 a month? You know, you've got to be able to find a way to pay for this. And so it's about it again, it always comes down to either free labor or money. It's those two things. It gets down to capitalism. It gets down to how do we take advantage of those that are most vulnerable.
I think there's something significant in that element that Mara points out of a lot of the diets that these right-wing influencers are talking about being pretty average advice about like eating lean meat and veggies that you might hear from a friendly gym trainer. Because in repackaging uncontroversial advice around food and marketing it as an entry point, it's much easier for more insidious ideas to creep through. Criticism can be deflected as well with the idea of like, oh, he's just trying to get men healthy. Meanwhile, direct messages and private group chats continue the path towards more extreme ideas. One researcher, Patrick Hermanson, investigated the phenomenon of online gym groups being infiltrated by the far right. Observing fitness groups over several months, Hermanson monitored how members were initially lured in with health tips and later encouraged into the closed chat groups where the far right shared content. One admin of a group posted a picture of himself in a gym mirror with the message, "Training to stop a bus loaded with Soros-paid protesters." Another member said, "Defend your race, defend your land, achieve immortality." Because this support of men's fitness for far-right figureheads, it's not really for these men's personal health or wellness, as Hermanson explains. These fitness groups frame individual self-improvement as a part of a wider political struggle, creating fresh motivation and a sense of purpose for people who believe that physical confrontation and violence are legitimate and necessary. They have become a space for far-right activists to mobilize. Another ideology-connected diet of the far right is one I mentioned earlier, the carnivore diet. The one that, in the hands of the far right, has become a kind of modern medicine against the downfall of proper men, making claims of a kind of natural primal urge of men to consume animals. Flesh, organs, fat, bone marrow, raw eggs, all form the basis of this diet.
When it comes down to it, humans are animals. We have a way of eating as well. A lot of us don't. My point is, 80% of your diet should be eggs and meat. We're meat eaters. And of course, you can throw your other foods in there like the fruits and the peanuts and the seeds and stuff like that. But the majority of your plate should come from animals. To eat like a man, you're going to look and feel like a man.
In some extreme cases, this is the sole food consumed. Protein is, of course, connected to like muscle health, but it isn't just any protein that these men's health gurus are pushing. There's no tofu here. This push for meat in America is often linked to the burger patty and beef steaks that already have cultural familiarity and serve as a contrast to the weak, effeminate left. In a world where we're increasingly aware of beef production's impact on the climate, a subsection of the far right which denies even the very existence of climate change, or at least humans' role in it, engaging in an extreme meat-based diet is also an ideological fuck you that goes beyond gender. In many cases, these ideological connections are stated outright in content espousing the virtues of carnivorism. But there's also content which seems disconnected from politics at first. It's individuals giving candid personal accounts of how much energy they have, how strong they feel, how right this diet seems to be for them. But the messages start to creep in about why strength is valued for them as men, about their abilities to be what their women want, and how this diet could give you power too. The power that men are owed. Food and femininity. All the ways that we've just seen of food constructing an ideal of conservative masculinity is ultimately connected to how important gender limitations and binaries are to far-right beliefs. And the same can, of course, be seen with femininity too. When it comes to women's traditional relationship with food in America, there are two main areas to consider. One is the expectation that they will prepare food for their husbands and their children. This was and is, for many, seen as a kind of sacred role. There is no higher calling for women. But also, there's the duty of women to be skinny. We need to remain attractive to our husbands, who can't help but be unfaithful or hateful if we don't lose the weight we've naturally gained through aging or the constant state of pregnancy that some conservatives expect women to be in. And attractive means slim. In short, traditional women must provide food, but also abstain from it. And traditional womanhood, well, that's a hallmark of right-wing America, particularly within the far right. So let's start with the second point, women's duty to maintain a specific kind of body, one that is attractive to our husband, especially. Academia can tell you a lot about a topic, but sometimes you need to go to first-hand sources. So I decided to dive into conservative women's magazine, Evie, to try and get a deeper understanding of conservative femininity and food through their health section. It was, honestly, a lot of what I'd expected. Evie articles about weight consistently reinforce popular fat-phobic misconceptions, like fat people are delusional about their weight, that insisting on just the existence of fat phobia is pseudoscientific and a delusional state of mind, whereas skinny shaming is both real and very harmful. The body positivity movement is cringeworthy because it forces women to objectify themselves and display their gross, uncovered bodies to the world. But when Evie has a photo shoot of a skinny model in a bikini, that's empowering. So the website and magazine is set up a classic glossy mag that we're probably all familiar with. But Evie specifically pairs the generic sections like health, beauty, and relationships with right-wing talking points like the importance of women to become mothers. Seriously, so much of this website is about how you should get off your birth control. Also, just to sprinkle it in there, I had a phrenology article because apparently we're back in our racist, skull-shaped pseudoscience era. Evie exemplifies the right's obsession with thin white women. In the Open Democracy article, How the Far Right is Using Thinness to Radicalize Women and Teen Girls, Lois Shearing writes, "For far-right women, there is no such thing as body positivity or body neutrality. Thinness is a moral imperative. It shows dominance over the body and aligns oneself with European beauty standards." But that's not how Evie directly advertises thinness. And I think that's important to remember. These articles aren't outright saying the thing. While they do emphasize self-discipline and virtues associated with thinness, I mean, think about how their articles imply or even outright say that fat people and fat advocates are delusional or morally wrong. The main point that they seem to make is that skinny is achieving your full potential. And so, women raised in a house with a mother who reads this magazine, who gets bought a copy as a teenage treat, being able to read a grown-up mag for the first time. You know, it talks about kissing and fashion. The political side of it can slip in between the cracks. In an interview with Shearing, Hazel Woodrow, a researcher at Anti-Hate Canada, explained the logic behind this tactic. "If I was trying to radicalize a young girl, I would incite an eating disorder, because your capacity for critical thought is kneecapped by starvation, and it would be easy to introduce a racialized aspect to it." Let's look at an example from the source itself. A few quotes from an article in Evie by Jamie Marshall entitled, "I'm happier when I'm skinny." The fat acceptance movement is not one born out of compassion, but demoralization. It's a movement centered above all else on giving up, giving into your baseline, hedonistic desires, rather than demanding more of yourself, so you can reach self-actualization. Beauty is incredibly important. It's what inspires us to achieve greatness. It moves people to realize profundity, even seeing something divine in a captivating work of art. That's why I intuit that any movement whose objective is to make something uglier is deeply wicked. And what about the process of self-improvement? The prospect of having a higher goal to work towards is an essential aspect of self-actualization. Why shouldn't we demand the best of ourselves? This girl boss type language is so pointed from an outsider perspective, because Evie also seems to actively discourage women from building careers. In a way, the focus on food and bodies is a way to deal with deferred female ambition. Your body and your family is your only project worth pursuing. Put all that drive and energy that other women are spending on the wrong kinds of self-empowerment into constantly criticizing yourself in order to keep clinging to the mission of self-improvement. As one of their Instagram posts claims, "Being a mother is a successful career choice. There's nothing demeaning about devoting your life to your children and your home." You can see this focus on a kind of liberal boogeyman, an imagined persecutor of conservative souls, someone who's somehow forbidding you from being able to unapologetically aspire to be in shape, a kind of absurd idea of a fat left-wing activist yelling at you for going to your home gym and loving your kids, I guess. Evie's food content isn't harmless. They promote eating only 1,200 calories a day, back-to-back dieting, constantly being on the lookout for bad foods, and dedicating a significant portion of your brain power to obsessing over food. This all feeds into the first point that I made in this section, the idea that right-wing women's role centers around cooking and feeding her husband and children. My American friend that I mentioned earlier broke down the dynamic of a family in the South for me. The women of the family were taught to cook at an early age. At family gatherings, women were expected to all be in the kitchen. Men's connection to food was through one specific exception: the grill. Men do the meat, women do the sides. Not just at big gatherings, but everyday meals too. Women make the food, set the table, and serve it. And then they watch for the men to begin eating before they do. And when they do eat, it's different portions. As she explained, women cook, they don't eat. Even those women growing up who are allowed to take part in the enjoyment of eating were still expected to do so in a way that never compromised their looks. By that, it meant their weight. While talking to Mara, she brought up the mistaken idea that cults and organizations and beliefs that mirror them have to have a human cult leader. Instead, she suggested extreme diet movements create internal cult leaders, a kind of panopticon of self, where the voice controlling you comes from within, yet is still ultimately out of your control in many ways. Within this framework, there's a subsection of right-wing women become particularly susceptible to this, ones whose very sense of self and purpose is tied to the labor they do for others, being a good wife and a perfect mother, a desire for a perfection of self, but a perfection of self for the good of others, looking good for your husband, producing the best food for your families, taking the best care of your children. And that internal cult leader is enforced by the wider cultural beliefs of the communities that they're in.
And admit you're in danger.
Who are you talking to right now?
important when looking at this kind of radicalization to also think about paths to de-radicalization, including practical ideas for women financially trapped in these far-right communities. But it's important also to challenge the cultural archetype of the pure white woman, framing all of these women as helpless victims of right-wing brainwashing, suffering under the yokes of their husbands, and innocent victim needing to be saved. To fall for this fragile image of whiteness and womanhood is to feed into the very harmful racial dynamics the alt-right perpetuates, beliefs which have grown increasingly more mainstream through the rise of women as far-right influencers. There's this breakdown of successful content on the internet that you'll often see, that if you want to build a solid career, you need to either inform, entertain, or inspire with what you make. The far-right has honed in on their strategy that works: how-to videos, tutorials, and inspiration content combine with an aspirational aesthetic to pull viewers in. They use these three pillars of content to lead to an ultimate goal of convincing people. Far from the over-the-top alt-right kind of bro podcasts, this content made by women is often more insidious. Smiling white women with organic cotton prairie dresses showing you how to make jam. You can scroll through a bunch of her videos, see the bright-eyed gaggle of kids helping her decorate Christmas cookies, then a what I wear on a date night with my husband carousel of images, and then a recipe for natural surface cleaner for your kitchen, and think, even subconsciously, that this is the kind of simple, calm, happy life that I probably love. You give her a follow, knowing that a handful more of her recipes will appear when you scroll, probably knowing you'll save them and never actually get around to making them. But small things begin to creep around the edges of the videos. The mention of a Bible quotation that you don't recognize on a video with her husband, which, if you'd look it up, is all about the importance of women being subservient to men. Or maybe she's reposted a video from a biased news source into your feed, talking about a violent crime that this source emphasizes was the work of immigrants. You might not even notice it's on your feed because she's the one who reposted it. The implications within her videos about her kids, talking about why she's choosing to homeschool them, the types of things that they're being taught in these mainstream schools she just doesn't agree with, you know, the danger that they're exposed to without specifying what exactly it is, the implication that this is what you do if you're a good mother who cares about her kids. This isn't an overtly political account, this isn't a right-wing news source, it's just a woman sharing her perfect life, her life of chores and childcare and organic healthy recipes, with a kind of, you know, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed view of women who don't think their family is important enough to do the same. The YouTuber Blonde Buttermaker has a series of videos sharing organic recipes for nut milk and berry preserving, along with messaging about white European paganism. Again, a dog whistle of a topic for the far right. Many of these women are what has been termed tradwives, women with traditional values, many of whom see feminism as a dogmatic and extreme movement that demonizes their choice to focus on child rearing and homemaking.
People on this app act like this is the worst thing in the world. Stay-at-home mum. My husband's at work providing for our family. I have some sourdough fermenting on the bench, a baby, an apron, a cute dress.
Yet, this surface understanding ignores the many feminists whose life and passion lies in family life. It's a mistake to categorize all women making content about their home lives, cooking for their families, or having cleaning tips as the same as those seeping far-right rhetoric into their content.
I love abortion and trans people and migrants and birth control and immigrants and gay people and having fun and just being a nice and overall good person.
Indeed, this equating of the two is exactly what lets so many of these accounts fly under the radar. Because while ideas of cultural heritage, community knowledge sharing, and a respect for tradition can be engaged with by anyone for any reason, they're all ideas which have been used as dog whistles by the far right. Cultural heritage becomes white supremacy, a respect for tradition becomes enforced gender roles and queer and transphobia, and community knowledge sharing, well, women have organised bake sales to fund white supremacist groups and offer guidance to one another about food, cooking, and natural living. Food is a connective thread that links women's worlds at home with broader communities outside the domestic sphere. Kathleen Blee describes white supremacist recruitment among women taking place through mundane activities like grocery shopping and community picnics, or during discussions about the threats from chemicals that could poison their children's food and water, which should segue into talk of other noxious influences, such as ideological or racial ones. The danger is in the mobilization of far-right women into women's spaces, talking about women's issues in service of far-right goals. Women who might be put off by the violent misogyny of the alt-right are not as immediately put off by this seeming innocence of a social media influencer. This isn't some out-of-touch grandma ranting about the good old days. These are women packaging their beliefs as a kind of counterculture to the stresses of a chaotic and uncertain modern life, and eventually to the angry, miserable feminists who seem intent on empowering you to be trapped within it. because it's not purely political in the way that overt propaganda is. You don't have to be searching for this type of content for it to find you, and it's especially likely to appear to people who are seeking knowledge. In other words, people who don't necessarily have existing context with which to create a balanced view. Your kid is struggling in local primary school, for example, so you search how to start homeschooling, and then far-right tradwife adjacent content will find you. It's an algorithmic pipeline that the far right has been taking advantage of for years. The second author I interviewed as research for this video is Kendall Vanderslice, a food and theology scholar who actually works as a baker, running workshops that combine baking bread and worship. She found the surface level similarities of her work and the aesthetics of many of these far-right accounts revealed the dangerous potential in this algorithmic pipeline.
This is largely now an aesthetic movement of what's taking over, because I think there's different sort of underlying motivation behind that different content, but I think consumers of that content I think many do not notice the nuances of that. And I don't even think the algorithm necessarily notices the nuances of that. And so what people then get fed, like maybe someone at first notices some of those nuances, but then the more they're in it, they're sort of inoculated to them. And then it becomes sort of increasingly more far right the longer that they engage with the content. So I experienced this quite dramatically over the last couple of years. Like my main job is that I teach workshops on how to bake bread as a spiritual practice. I teach them in churches and retreat centers and colleges. And when I first started, like prior to 2020, there was not a ton of there was no Christian bread making content on social media. I was sort of the weird person who was like, I think we can find a lot of joy in making bread. And then you have 2020, sort of sourdough takes off. And then 2022 is really when sort of the conservative Christian far right version of sourdough being this lead into government conspiracy sort of trajectory takes off. I found that I suddenly was getting a lot of followers that were sort of deeply far right. And if I said anything political, then I just got inundated with emails and messages that I never would have gotten before, because there was just sort of this assumption of well, you're a Christian and you bake bread, therefore you must be in this world.
And then what is not acknowledged by these far-right influencers is that what they're doing itself is work. The vision of life that they curate on their accounts, where all they do is cooking perfect meals and lightly cleaning an already spotless house, that's only part of the story. Their baby is still sicking up, their toddlers are still throwing food on the floor, their husbands still leaving skid marks in their underwear they're washing off camera. It isn't all idyllic perfection. But even if it was, the thing that would allow it to be that way is the helping hand of money generated by the videos themselves. Even discounting their husband's income, the ad revenue and brand deals on daily videos with hundreds and thousands of views is a part of that lifestyle. These women often encourage their female viewers not to earn money through traditional work, to focus on their family instead, while gaining financial stability themselves in the process with those very videos. Money that can be used to buy the organic food and seasonal decorations that feature in the videos as a kind of moral imperative to the viewers. Even for those who could buy ample raw ingredients, there's the fact that prepping and cooking every dish is a full-time job. Just ask any early 1900s housewife. It was in part the influx of commercial canned foods and packaged meals amidst the post-World War II economic boom that liberated women to pursue paid work. To suggest that these kinds of convenience foods are inherently bad is to take issue with the working woman. She can't devote as much time and energy to food prep, so she feeds her family more processed items, ostensibly worsening their diet and increasing their risk for the chronic diseases that now plagued this country. The message? If we just went back to a simpler time, when women knew their proper role at home, we'd have purer food, and in turn, better health. And if you do give your kid frozen chicken nuggets for dinner, well, you've basically poisoned them. And for many women, there's nothing more motivating than shame. A shame which can be found in the most personal and influential of places: food and Christianity. Christianity is a key pillar of American conservatism, which underlies a lot of the ideas that we've talked about so far, from political morality to the gender binary. As I mentioned at the start, this video didn't start out being about the far right. It actually started out because my co-writer Isabel stumbled across the phenomenon of Christian diet books.
What would Jesus eat? If your answer is bread and wine, you are correct.
And so within a list of video essay ideas that she sent me last month, number 8 simply read, American Christianity and Diet Culture. I was intrigued. Normally the things that grab me are stuff that I've already been thinking about. But although I've made a few videos about diet culture, I never thought about the role religion might play. So naturally, I replied, I need to know your take for option A. She explained her thinking behind the suggestion, and I was even more interested. And so we actually started our research for this video within Christian diet spaces specifically. Now, it's important to note here that fasting, religious diets, and food restriction are all legitimate ways to practice faith. All Abrahamic religions, for example, call for their followers to either avoid certain foods or to restrict the intake of food during certain periods of time, like Ramadan, Lent, or Yom Kippur, for example. Some might keep kosher or halal, or follow elements of Mosaic law. Some might abstain from alcohol. Certain Christian monks follow vegetarian diets, and that's not to mention religions outside of these three. Like, these relationships to food can be deeply meaningful. They can represent tradition, a way to feel closer to your community, your ancestors, your God. It can be a way to increase gratitude, to remind you not to take certain comforts for granted. It can be paired with acts of charity. And even if you don't follow any individual religion, you might still participate in food restriction for spiritual or ethical reasons. Maybe you don't buy brands that you consider to be unethical. Maybe you don't eat meat. Maybe you choose to only eat local seasonal produce. I say all of that to make it clear that the Christian diets that we found are not any of that. They're books and plans which co-opt deep religious convictions so they can sell believers what's normally a fad diet, but is occasionally a dangerous one. This kind of content is not new. The 1957 book Pray Your Weight Away by Charles Shedd was a Christian weight loss book that claimed obesity was tied to sinfulness, which is essentially the foundation of the Christian weight loss movement. This harmful sentiment is echoed in the dozens of following Christian diet books, with titles like More of Me, Less of Jesus, Slim for Him, The Devil Wants Me Fat, Full, Food Jesus and the Battle for Satisfaction, What Would Jesus Eat? And so many more. So coming back to talk about these books while filming this, after speaking to Kendall, is so depressing because Kendall's work is like a really genuinely interesting, community-based, connected way of thinking about the presence of food within biblical texts and people's relationship with God and with each other, with communities, individual spiritual practice, in a way that is not then tied to selling people the idea that they are fundamentally broken, that they look wrong, that what they're putting in their bodies is wrong. And it just was such a stark contrast between the ways in which food can be used in a positive way to do with faith and spirituality and community, and then this other way. Now, some of these books in this genre, like What Would Jesus Eat? They kind of just are like knockoff Mediterranean diets that emphasize getting rid of processed foods and red meat, interspersed with motivational pieces of scripture. But then there are ones like the Daniel Plan. So the New York Times actually pulled a bunch of choice quotes from this plan in an article that they did on this genre, including these ones. God isn't going to evaluate you on the basis of the bodies he gave to other people, but he will judge what you did with what you have been given. Satan does not want you living a healthy life because that honors God. Why should God heal you of an obesity-related illness if you have no intention of changing the choices that led to it? Once again, fatness in this view of Christianity is not a morally neutral state. It represents the outward manifestation of inner sins, of like sloth, gluttony, and greed. The devil wants you to be fat. So if you lose weight, you're defeating the devil. Why aren't you defeating the devil? Like, do you not understand that your body belongs to God? Why are you wasting the most precious gift he ever gave you? Stop defying God's plan. It adds religious guilt onto the body-shaming dumpster fire that already has so many people in a chokehold. And it's being sold for profit. Oral Roberts University, a Christian university in Oklahoma that makes its students sign a contract promising that they won't engage in occult practices or homosexuality, ran a mandatory weight loss program for its students in the 70s called POPs, or the Pounds Off program. In POPs, any student at the university it deemed obese had to lose weight to avoid expulsion. Let me say that again. The university expelled students on the basis of their weight. One article covering the program at the time wrote that since the program began, 4 students have been suspended for failing to reduce. One student who was ordered to reduce from 215 to 160 pounds and lost only 10 said he maintained a 3.7 grade point average but received one letter after another, always threatening suspension. He left the university after receiving a letter last summer telling him that before you will be able to complete registration this fall, you must report for a weight check. To be readmitted, your weight must be at or below 198 pounds. The school asked this student to lose 50 pounds and then expelled him for not losing weight fast enough. Fat students also had to attend special lectures where teachers would use scripture to demean them. For example, one lecturer said, "You know, in the book of Romans, Paul says that 2:28 is the verse in case you want to look it up, all things work together for good to those that love God, who are called according to his purpose. Now, my goodness, how can anything like fat be good? And how can God have purpose in a person being fat?" It was so bad that fat students had to partner with the ACLU to file a complaint with the Department for Health, Education and Welfare. But Rowan, this was the 1970s. Everyone was crazy back then. The grapefruit diet was a thing that people thought was common sense. Well, in 2016, Oral Roberts University required its students to wear fitness trackers and graded them on their step count. Fitness at Oral Roberts University, it's not really about health. It's about supposed piety. A former provost at the university, Carl Hamilton, said, "Our body is the home of the Holy Spirit. Making that home a fit one is one of the ways to glorify God and the Holy Spirit." Do you see how this echoes the failed potential sentiment in those toxic articles from EV magazine? Both of these spaces constantly tell fat people that their fatness means that they are failing some higher purpose, that their fatness stands in the way of them fulfilling some sort of self-fulfillment and God's prophecy. There is this kind of seemingly religious fueled fat-phobic diet culture in evangelical spaces in particular, and it's easy to see how an initial interest in a diet book which seems to take your faith into account might lead to discovering these more extreme far-right ideas that are then tied to it. Instead of using food as a way to be closer to God or your religious community, these diet plans and body-shaming courses become products that religion helps sell. It's a stark example of how religious language and even spiritual experiences can be co-opted for other purposes. One of the most infamous examples of this was the Remnant Fellowship Christian Diet, which is plagued with accusations of functionally being a cult that promoted child abuse and used religion to enrich its leader, Gwen Shamlin. The organisation told members that fat was sin manifest and that they could help them, particularly women, reach their weight loss goals through praying their way through hunger. In one interview, Shamblin outlined her philosophy: how to stop bowing down to the refrigerator and how to bow back down to him. An article from The Guardian in 2021 explains the findings of a documentary series about Shamblin and her organisation. As The Way Down illustrates, over 3 increasingly ominous episodes, Shamblin exerted more and more power over members' finances, marriages, custody arrangements, parenting, social media, and eventually all contact with the outside world. Testimonies from ex-members and those threatened with the loss of family members to the insular group, which believes it is the only path to heaven, demonstrate how Remnant was actually about power and controlling people's lives, controlling their weight, controlling their marriages, controlling their finances. And this diet program was popular with evangelical women for more than just the connection to supposed scripture. It also promised something many women were desperately craving: a framework for weight loss that felt meaningful, infused with the righteousness and familiarity of religion, a community and common purpose beyond the home. It was the promise of a path to being the right kind of woman, to adhering to the body and soul that a good Christian man would find desirable. The diet itself was nothing new. The usage of God and the power and pressure that comes with that for evangelical women in particular had the power to exert a kind of control that made Shamblin rich. Thinness is not some universal Christian belief. Jesus' biggest hits kind of included feeding a lot of people. The New Testament has this lovely piece of advice, actually, from Romans, ironically. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. And perhaps even more sassily, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? What good is it, huh? Typically, Christians celebrate Easter and Christmas with a feast, and yet this cultural message of food purity and faith so often seems to want to counter this. As one of my patrons explained, food was often mentioned in sermons, and it was usually discussed as either something you could do for the community to lead people to Christ, but there were other times when it was brought up in a more your body is a temple way. These sermons would focus on how you should eat healthy things and avoid alcohol because the denomination, Church of God Pentecostal, I was in, focused a lot on how you could be filled with the Holy Spirit, and you would be more likely to receive the Holy Spirit if you did those things. Paradoxically, there was usually a potluck full of rather unhealthy food, as Southern food in general tends not to be the healthiest, afterwards. So in the case of my patron, they're put in a paradoxical situation. In order to be admired in the community, you need to avoid unhealthy foods, but to participate in the community, you need to consume those supposedly unhealthy foods too, because this isn't a purely religious phenomenon, it's cultural and political too. There are wider implications of our food and bodies that intersect intersect with religious ideas. Take muscular Christianity, for example, a movement popularized in the US in the 19th century. That might sound familiar to the examples from that section earlier about food and masculinity. Getting swole for Jesus, if you're a guy, that is. Claiming that sports and athleticism was a manly way to practice Christianity. The rise of the movement in the US has been tied specifically to a kind of traditionalist anxiety around the place of white men in America during the emergence of the social changes like the women's rights movement and increased immigration to the US at the time. In contrast, empowerment for evangelical women, it's not about building strength through muscle, but a kind of gentle, ineffable strength of motherhood. Some ultra-conservative Christian communities see this as a quest that is equally tied to increasing the number of children in a family as it is for caring for those children.
Somehow staying at home and taking care of those kids and creating this wonderful home is somehow more empowering for women. But ask anyone who's ever had one child, never mind 6, how relaxing that is. I mean, there's a lot of joy in raising children. I have a daughter. There's a lot of joy in raising my daughter. But there's this whole idea of quiverful, right? You're not supposed to have one kid. You're supposed to have a quiverful, right? Because you're creating, soldiers for the army, right? And all of that sort of thing. And so the idea that you're raising all of those kids, is a tremendous amount of work, but is being sold under this idea of the trad wife, that it's somehow really easy.
Ultimately, biblical Christian values around food, ideas of feeding the needy, for example, can become warped from right-wing rhetoric that suggests that some people are needy due to their own faults. If their actions, their sins even, are the reason that they're in need, then that's God's will, right? And so, many far-right models of Christianity become incompatible with working-class food security, meaningful acts of charity, or anti-poverty work. Food and class. Right-wing American attitudes to class are honestly fascinating to me. On the one hand, there are these clear examples of rampant classism within right-wing policies and rhetoric, but then they're simultaneously using working-class archetypes to appeal to a certain working-class demographic, essentially separating them out into the right and wrong kind of poor American. So on the one hand, you have the good poor, the salt of the earth, the deserving. These are, unsurprisingly, often working-class white people. It's a demographic that the far right can target by leaning into this good-bad divide, and food is a key part of that divide. In this context, meat, for example, isn't just about masculinity. It's a symbol for the American everyman, a meat and potatoes kind of guy who's down to earth. And vegans in this narrative become middle-class elites who are out of touch with what working people need. Vegan food is characterized as fancy and fussy, and the descriptions of the food go on to reflect those eating it. Your food habits become a show of political morality removed from the food itself. Think about the Evie articles deriding anyone pointing out even the existence of fat phobia. Overweight left-wingers become evidence of excessive liberalism, a political class of self-indulgent decadence, sinful and uncontrolled, looking for lazy handouts. The way that manifests in singular bodies is then projected onto entire political movements. Think about these people want to spend your hard-earned money on themselves kind of view of socialism, for example. Ultimately, any food or eating habit can be politicized because it's just kind of mostly symbolic, right? Like, there's nothing inherently masculine about meat or fancy about vegan food in and of itself. I mean, beans on toast is vegan, and I know a few people who swear by red meat on their periods. But this just means that it's primed for cultural and political movements to project their own meaning onto them, especially if they hook into existing associations. My American friend who grew up in the South pointed out, right-wing white poverty was church supplies and food pantries. It wasn't seen as shameful in the way urban resources like EBT and WIC were. Those were government handouts, which was seen as different. Another of my patrons had a similar experience. My family was absolutely poor enough to be on food stamps, but my parents never participated in the program. As a poor pastor's kid, we received help from the community all the time, but we never accepted the government's help. My mum in particular looks down on people who accept handouts, even though she herself has needed help quite often. It isn't that the political parties in America are split by class, it's that class struggles are used to reinforce other inequalities and prejudices like racism or ableism. Instead of seeing the similarities of economic disenfranchisement, poor white people in conservative communities are encouraged to see the source of aid as a dividing difference. This cognitive dissonance allows for a clear chain of blame between everyday money difficulties and other poor people. The other poor people are those outside a homogenized white Christian community. The lack of geographical and cultural connection means bad poor people are a kind of imagined hypothetical for many. Stories of food stamps being used for the wrong things combines with the existing racial stereotypes to create the welfare queen stereotype, for example. And so this kind of chain of logic kicks in. People abuse and scrounge off government handouts. Government handouts are an urban luxury. Urban areas are black areas. Black people are scrounging off our community's hard-earned money. The dominoes fall, and the finger is white supremacy. One of my patrons explained how their family members, who would talk a lot about how opposed they were to how easy getting food stamps and handouts was, were having these discussions based on assumptions rather than knowledge. Ironically, once I moved out and was living on my own, I was told at one point by my mum that I should apply for food stamps because I didn't make a lot and should take advantage of it. I had to explain to her that I didn't qualify just because I was in a low income bracket, and she was genuinely surprised to hear the actual eligibility requirements. In fact, I think a lot of people will be surprised by this Nielsen report. Today, a consumer needs $132 to buy what $100 bought in 2019. Dry groceries and meat cost 4% more than they did in 2019. While high-income households can afford fresh, healthful food and the foods touted as medicine, households that suffer from food insecurity cannot. This group includes children, people of colour, and people whose income is low, but not low enough to qualify for the Federal Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. In fact, 1/3 of people who face hunger do not qualify for SNAP. There are, I think, some white people whose only experience of structural oppression is financial, who are also deeply invested in the ideology of the American dream. What this means in practice is that they become incapable of seeing the systemic elements of class, but instead choose to view financial struggles as a personal shortcoming, or even momentary bad luck. In doing so, they're able to distance themselves from other poor or working class people who are black or Muslim or queer or disabled or all of the above, instead of engaging with class solidarity. Indeed, because they see class as an easily changeable state if only you work hard enough, those marginalized by other forms of oppression as well, or who are unable to affect poverty, become proof of that marginalized group's inherent failings. And meanwhile, this type of poor white person is able to buy into tax cuts for the rich, or the upholding of the 1% as role models, or even the belief in a white nationalist state, because they are only a few more work shifts and a great business idea away from being rich and benefiting from that vision of progress. But it isn't just white people whose only experience of structural oppression is financial who fall into this trap. White women who suffer from sexism can make a similar internal bargain, but rather than in the workforce, their labour in weight of being granted individual power is adhering to traditional white womanhood itself. If the poor white man is told to play the game of capitalism to succeed, the poor white woman is told to play the game of gender. I think we can see this divisive and racialized class warfare evident in those parts of the far-right movement who are embracing welfare precisely for their end goal of creating a white Christian American ethno-state. I spoke to Kendall about the parts of the far-right who see their own use of current welfare systems as almost a means to an end.
So there are some pockets that are sort of this idea of like, we have as many children as possible, and then through that we like raise up our army of Christians that can like, you know, move things politically the way we want in the next generation. And within that community, it's very important that the woman stays home and is like having children as much as possible through the entirety of her childbearing years. And so for the most part, there is a lot of comfort taking government assistance for food because it's the only way that the system works.
I think it's a kind of audacious entitlement that weaves its way into these practices and acts as moral reassurance that any feats of logic or seemingly contradictory actions are justified because the end goal is what's important. The utopian imagery of a nice white America with picket fences and apple pies from people who give interviews about how they just want the best for their kind. That it's not racist or transphobic or ableist to want those people to go elsewhere, never acknowledging what it would take to enact this vision. One of my patrons explained how welfare was discussed growing up in a Republican family. I got this idea that welfare shouldn't be a government thing because it was inefficient, maybe taken advantage of. It should be the place of church communities and non-profits, which around us did to some extent help people out. Like our church community would take offerings for families in it who were struggling, and we semi-regularly donated to help a local Christian homeless shelter. The key detail here for me is the lack of thought for those outside of the Christian community. The worldview that they're taught was that social welfare in its entirety should be removed from government control, but given to churches instead, who would then take care of those in their direct congregation who sought out Christian charities. This is a clear echo for me of a history which connects many of the topics that we've covered so far. The combination of religion, politics, class, and food that is the history of Christian missionary work. Western colonialism was built on the backs of these missions, both official and unofficial, which sought to bring not just Christian ideas, but conversion and re-education, a practice which damaged and in many cases ultimately destroyed native populations' belief systems and cultures. Christian missionary work, as an exercise in conversion rather than pure charity, relies on the idea of other nations and cultures being backwards or lesser than, and feeds into right-wing extremist views around immigration, food, and white nationalism. Everything in this video has been connected. Policing of gender, Christian evangelism, class divides, and the next part of the puzzle is, inevitably, race. It's impossible to talk about the far right in America and not talk about racism, xenophobia, and anti-immigrant prejudice. I spoke to Mara about the fact I was planning to talk about both religion and race in this video, and she immediately clocked a key connection between the two, the deep roots of racism within the American evangelical church.
Evangelicalism is all about racism. You know, there's mega churches, and there are white mega churches and black mega churches. But in terms of evangelicalism, there's a book called White Evangelical Racism, and it is all about how evangelicalism within the United States has been built around the ideas of keeping white kids separate from black children. You know, this goes back to Brown v. Board of Education, when segregation of schools was starting to happen or be erased, right? So suddenly black children could go to white schools. Well, that's when evangelicals started saying, oh no, you know, the government has to help pay for private schools. And it wasn't that all of a sudden that they became really religious. It's like they didn't want their kids to be in the same school as black kids. And so, you know, we see, you know, over and over and over again, the policies that evangelicals want to implement have everything to do with racism.
One of my patrons sent me their great uncle's letters and other writings about growing up Southern Baptist, and it included one section which explained a similar observation from the point of view of people at the time. The unspoken custom was that since we were white, we would get the better house to stay in, and the races did not mingle socially. Whites were welcome at black churches, but blacks were not to attend white churches, and these customs and many others were enforced, at times forcefully. The far right and these subsections of the church aren't both using food to reinforce the same ideas around gender because of some accidental intersection of beliefs. The white supremacist basis of the far right is just as much part of those evangelical churches which preach the superiority of traditional American family values to a sea of white faces. The issues of gender and food within the far right are inherently connected with race too. There are entire books written about the ways that black women's bodies have been politicized, their gender critiqued, and their personhood questioned over the centuries. And this area, food, is no exception. Now, think about the image the far right sells of white womanhood, an image of a small and delicate body that is natural, either because her body looks that way with no effort, or because she is naturally able to hone her body to be that way. Ideas of racial purity are not simply about someone's circumstances of birth. There is a right way to be white to these groups, and food is a significant part of that right way. In an analysis of one white separatist group's discourses on gender and motherhood, healthy food and a holistic lifestyle was found to be key to a racially pure home. This guidance is shared through newsletters or websites with names like Women's Frontier. Organic, raw fruits and vegetables are particularly encouraged, contrasted with the billion-dollar Jew food industry that threatens the health and vitality of white people. In these cases, hate is honed through nutritious food, lovingly prepared by white women for their families. Healthy food is a symbolic stand-in for responsibility, love, intelligence, and more. The idea of having proper food for your family is not just an individual action facilitated by things like time, money, or geography. It's evidence of these white people's moral and biological superiority. They are good people who care about their families. Anyone without the money, time, or even interest in adhering to a strict diet is an evidence of the inherent failings of entire populations. They are lazy, uncaring, mentally inferior even. As Professor Sabrina Strings puts it, to the extent that people were linking indulgence in the oral appetite to an animalistic inability to control oneself, fatness became linked to the racial group judged to lack lack the capacity for self-government, black people. So-called race science presents itself as a kind of reasonable racism by co-opting the language of scientific rationality and objectivity to peddle white supremacist ideas. Calling black people animals is obviously overtly racist, but concealing that implication under layers of pseudoscience and claims to authority is just as bad, but much easier to peddle to the masses, using jargon words and claims of genetic difference between races to make claims about the likelihood of a race to be criminal or unintelligent, or foregoing this complexity altogether and relying on out-of-context statistics, which imply any racialized differences between groups is innate and biological, rather than influenced by social context and systemic experiences, for example. And this connection between food and racism isn't specific to the modern far right. It's something that we see evidence of in everything from the scaremongering around MSG to the various slurs related to culture's cuisines. The patron who sent me their great-uncle's writings also included an anecdote which reveals the importance of food to the social rules of segregation. My great-uncles, my family is white, talk about their experiences with racism and segregation in their letters and other writings. But one thing that one uncle said really stood out to me. They had a racist aunt who was a staunch segregationist. Her view was that black people could be your family, even raise your children, but when it came to eating meals, they would have to eat in the kitchen while the rest of the white family ate in the dining room. She was an unreconstructed Southerner from the start and believed coloured people had their place and it was not the same as white folks. They made good workers and were like family members, but they were to keep their place. This meant they could clean house, nurse the sick, tend and practically raise the children, but at mealtime, their place was at the kitchen table. Conversations were often carried on at mealtime between the kitchen and the dining room. Remember what I said at the start about food being something that could create in and out groups? That's a tactic the far right has jumped on. The universal importance and familiarity of food means racist, xenophobic rhetoric can present cultural food variation as evidence of fundamental biological differences between us. Not just that cultures that eat unfamiliar food or use other tools to do so are different, but that they are lesser. I think that, most importantly, food is so foundationally cultural that differences in cuisine become marks not just of foreignness, but specifically, for the far right, of un-Americanness. And then, predictably, invented cultural crimes can be used to stoke that racialized hatred. Take, for example, the hoax story last year of Haitian immigrants killing and eating American neighborhood pets in Ohio. Not true, fake news as they say, but the story spread. Trump repeated the claims as if they were true, because of course he did, along with other political figures like Vance and Musk, lending them a kind of legitimacy, especially to particular communities. And again, this isn't new. As John Chen persuasively argues, the symbolism of food figures prominently in anti-immigration rhetoric against Chinese people. The American Federation of Labor evoked the cultural connotations of food to argue for the undesirability of Asian immigration. In 1902, Samuel Gompers co-authored a tract calling for Asian exclusion, entitled Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Coolieism, Which Shall Survive? If someone can have such different ideas around something as simple as food, well, what other things might they be thinking or doing? That might be how they do it over there in that country, but that isn't how America does things. We don't want them coming over here and changing our food, our culture. The closest many people with these attitudes want immigrants to their food is serving it to them, or producing the ingredients needed on American farms, including prison farms. As Tradwife content shows us, food production is wholesome and pure when done in aesthetic homestead gardens, but industrialized manual labor, well, that suits black and brown bodies just fine. The irony, of course, is that our idea of a culturally white American foodscape is a homogenized nonsense, often co-opted from other cultures, particularly black enslaved Americans and their descendants. While in New York for work a few years ago, I had time to go to one museum and ended up making, I think honestly, the best decision I could have made by catching a brief temporary exhibit at the Museum of Food and Drink called African American Making the Nation's Table, and it was genuinely one of the best exhibits I've ever seen. As the official description explains, African American contributions to our nation's culinary culture are foundational and ongoing. For over 400 years, African Americans have inspired our nation's food through their skill, creativity, and entrepreneurship. Black foodways have shaped much of what we farm, what we cook, what we drink, and where we eat. Enslaved Africans helped develop our agricultural systems. African American chefs pioneered new ideas in the culinary arts. Black brewers and distillers crafted American spirits using African techniques. Black restaurateurs used commerce to promote activism and create food hubs that united communities. It isn't hard to argue that one of the least historically grounded traditions in America in terms of cultural food is white food. America is a country which has been continually constructing and reconstructing what whiteness is. What might be seen as white American food today was ethnically ethnic immigrant food just decades ago. And that shifting sand of culture is much easier to co-opt. It's much easier to cherry pick or even make up a food tradition and claim it as part of white culture, as a supposed historical tradition that somehow unites the white race under one strong banner of superior culture. If we want to talk about the history of whiteness and food in America, ultimately we need to talk about the dark origins of American colonialism. The history of colonialism is the history of food. They are inseparable because it combines the cultural assimilation of food practices with the violent tactics of food denial and destruction. Take the prevailing Christian American belief of the 1800s, manifest destiny. The idea that white Christians in America had not just a duty or a right, but a literal God-given destiny to expand westward to conquer the land and claim it as their own. This involved displacing native populations, by its very premise, and one of the ways to ensure not just migration but devastation of these traditional lands was in the extermination of the bison. During the 19th century, colonialists hunted and culled the species almost to extinction, with just a few hundred left alive at one point. Many native populations, which depended on bison hunting for their physical usage of the animal, but also held them in deep cultural regard. The Lakota or Blackfoot people, for example, the widespread death of these creatures was an arrogant show of supposed white supremacy, careless of the impact on those that hunted them for food in a way that preserved their numbers. But it wasn't just the bison that were used in food-based cultural warfare. During the Revolutionary War, American militiamen destroyed tens of thousands of bushels of Cherokee corn in order to starve Cherokee communities into submission. And this continued into the 20th century. In 1914, Hamilton presented Senator Lane's committee with blunt testimony about the American officers' custom of withholding treaty rations from certain Indians in order to starve out political opposition. Hamilton's allegations that McFatridge had starved 149 Blackfeet to death during the previous winter's battles over the surplus unallotted lands provisions raised a public uproar. Although subsequent investigations failed to officially document all of these deaths, a survey of the reservation revealed widespread starvation and malnutrition. The original bad poor in the states was the native population, a poverty which was manufactured and enforced, and then used to claim racial superiority. Colonial policymakers could use the results of their own starvation policies to justify more colonial policy under the guise of benevolent help on reservations. It wasn't just about the separation of cultures, but the destruction of them too. And then this coincides with the concept of religious superism, a name given to the practice during the Great Famine in the mid-1800s in Ireland, but which is a long-standing tool of religious oppression. It refers to the withholding of food for religious reasons. Sure, you can access these food banks or soup kitchens or rations if you listen to our sermons, if you give up your heathen ways, if you agree to convert. It was known in Ireland as superism because of the derogatory name given to Catholics who converted for food, supers, people who had taken the soup of Protestants. How desperate do you need to make a population before they are choosing between their survival and their culture and history? Not through great feasts and luxuries, but for bowls of soup. Perhaps the most effective way to erase culture is ensuring the upcoming generation doesn't have a chance to learn about it at all in the first place, so there's no chance of them passing it on to their children when they're grown. In addition to military force and the threat of arrest, federal agents also coerced Indian families to give up their children through systematic campaigns of hunger. By withholding the delivery of treaty rations on remote reservations during the winter, for instance, superintendents forced native parents to give up their starving children in the hope that they would at least be able to eat at the boarding school. Such was the case on the Hopi Reservation, where federal agents essentially laid siege until village families returned to deliver their children, as well as on the Ojibwe reservations of northern Minnesota, where Banks and many other children were taken. As I worked on this video, the ending became more and more clear to me, increasingly inevitable. I was writing and researching examples of prejudice and dehumanization and starvation being used as political tactics of control. I was unpacking all the ways that food has been used as a weapon. The American far right was the specific area that I decided to focus on, but as I'm sure you've realized by now, they aren't unique in this. There are so many dystopian but very real examples of those in positions of control using food to exert terrible power over people. In Congo, in Sudan, and in Gaza right now. Starvation is a word that's taken root in many of our minds for a long time now. A harsh and brutal word for a worse reality. Maybe for some of you, it's lost its meaning by now. Lost in the anonymity of statistics or the helplessness of distance. Starvation, the tactic. Starving, the experience. Men starving, women starving, children starving. Families, friends, neighbours, people starving. It takes a long time, but but barely any time at all. In a world where billionaires exist, starvation is a deliberate horror, and genocide is enacted just as much in the mill as in the munitions factory. Food is life, it is culture, and it is power. A power that I think many of us underestimate in the face of more overt violence or political regression. You see food as a personal thing, or a source of everyday fuel, or something that you struggle with mentally even, or a way to bond with your family. Yet this hyper-individualistic concept of food, one which often keeps us removed from the production of what we eat, is also how these insidious ideas about food and race and gender and class and religion can be slipped into our communities. And it's only when we look outwards at the rest of the table, rather than down our own plate, that we might begin to make change. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And as I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to join the Patreon community, help support me make these videos into the future, then I will leave a link in the description. I've also left links in the description of some organizations that you might want to check out, maybe support that work in issues of food justice. And until I see you next time, bye.